Silence is a source of great strength. They said they moved on. They smiled like nothing ever touched them. But then, out of nowhere, it arrives. That message. Hey, just thinking about you. It lands softly, but underneath, it's shaking, like the first tremor before an earthquake. You look at the words, simple, harmless, almost innocent. But somewhere between those letters is a question they're too afraid to ask out loud. Are you still there? Did I lose something real? Do you still think of me the way I never stopped thinking of you? This isn't just a message. It's a ripple from a wave they thought had settled. It's a whisper from a mind wrestling with a truth they buried beneath distractions, ego, and temporary thrills. Here's the part most people don't realize. Silence isn't emptiness. It's presence in disguise. It's the sound of someone choosing peace over performance, healing over havoc, clarity over chaos. See, when you walk away, not with anger, not with games, but with grounded calm, you do something rare in today's world. You don't leave a void, you leave a standard. And that standard, it echoes, it lingers, it confronts. Because while others flood timelines and inboxes with noise and neediness, you stepped back, not to punish, but to preserve. You didn't chase. You didn't perform. You simply released. And that's when something strange begins to unfold in their world. The very silence they mistook for indifference becomes a mirror that reflects not just what you were, but who they were around you. Their best self, their calmest self, the version of them that felt truly seen. Suddenly, every new connection feels a little too loud. Every conversation lacks that unseen safety net. They scroll through names, faces, memories, and none of it settles their spirit like yours did. Because it wasn't just you they missed, it was who they were when they were with you. And then the questions arise. Why didn't they chase me? Why does their peace bother me more than their anger would have? Why can't I stop thinking about someone who's not even trying to be remembered? Here's your answer. Because you didn't just leave, you evolved. And evolution isn't loud. It's silent. It doesn't scream to be seen. It just rises, quietly, unshakably. You became what Epictetus called free. Freedom is the only worthy goal in life, and it is attained by letting go of what is not in our control. You stopped needing their recognition to validate your worth. You no longer begged for understanding. You built your peace. You became the calm after the storm. So when they finally reach out, it's not always about love. It's about the noise your absence exposed. It's about the mirror your silence became. And now it's your turn to affirm that evolution. Say it with me. I choose calm. Write it in the comments. Let the world see the quiet strength in you. Let them see it. The ones who doubted, dismissed, or walked away from what they couldn't yet understand. I choose calm. Post it now, not to prove anything, but to honor the peace you've earned. Number 1. When your silence becomes the loudest thing they hear. One who does not understand your silence will probably not understand your words. At first, they filled the void with noise, loud nights, louder people, distractions dressed as new beginnings, anything to numb the quiet you left behind. They scrolled endlessly, smiled in photos, posted stories meant to prove they were unbothered. But silence has a way of sneaking in, between the laughs, beneath the surface, in the stillness of their own mind at midnight. It lingers like the scent of a fire, long extinguished, subtle, haunting, undeniable. Because the truth is, what you left behind wasn't just silence. It was presence. It was a reminder. It was a mirror. At first, they mistook your absence for passivity, but slowly, like fog clearing at dawn, they began to realize this wasn't avoidance, it was awareness. You didn't storm out to make a scene. You didn't slam the emotional doors behind you. You walked quietly, peacefully, with clarity. No final plea, no bitter ending, just stillness. And that stillness grew louder with every week that passed. Not because you said anything, but because you didn't. See, people are used to noise, to reactions, to closure with chaos. But when you remove your energy without anger or explanation, it disorients them. Suddenly, their story doesn't play out the way they rehearsed it in their head. They expected a chase, a crack in your composure, a late-night confession, but all they got was calm. And that calm, it echoed. Because what most don't realize is that the most powerful presence is sometimes the one that's no longer there. Your quiet wasn't empty. It was intentional. It was layered with truth. It wasn't about disappearing. It was about detaching with dignity. And that kind of detachment becomes unforgettable. They tried to replace it. Oh, they tried. With quick connections and shallow affirmations. With text threads that never quite felt right, and dates that felt more like distractions than possibilities. They laughed louder, talked more, but the depth never returned. The peace you brought with your presence couldn't be faked, and it couldn't be found again so easily. Because it wasn't just you they were missing. It was who they were when you were there. That version of themselves, calmer, more grounded, more understood. The version that didn't have to shout to be heard. The version that finally felt seen without performance. You didn't haunt them with manipulation. You didn't beg to stay in their thoughts. You simply existed with clarity, and then stepped away with grace. And grace? That's rare. In a world where people weaponize their wounds and cling to control through chaos, your stillness stood out. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. It didn't scream value, it radiated it. That's why, months later, they reach out. Not because they're bored, not because they need attention, but because they can't shake the contrast. The contrast between your presence and everyone else's performance. It's not a random message. It's a reckoning. Hey, just thinking about you. Translation: why does your calm still speak louder than my pride? Why haven't I forgotten the one who never asked to be remembered? Why does the silence I thought I wanted feel heavier than any conversation we ever had? This is the moment when the illusion fades, when the ego softens, when the noise they drowned themselves in finally quiets, and they realize what they lost wasn't just a person, but peace. You didn't retaliate. You elevated. You didn't argue your worth. You became it. Just like Marcus Aurelius taught, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. You didn't mirror immaturity. You didn't engage in emotional ping-pong. You simply returned to yourself, steadier, stronger, more whole. And now, your absence carries more weight than your presence ever demanded. This is what true detachment looks like. It's not bitterness, it's not avoidance, it's not pretending not to care. It's deciding that your energy is sacred, that your peace doesn't need an audience, that walking away doesn't make you weak, it makes you wise. Maybe you're reading this and wondering, was I too quiet? Should I have said more? But the answer is in the very question. You said everything without speaking, because silence, when rooted in self-respect, is louder than any explanation. It's the pause that echoes, the breath that unsettles, the peace that teaches. You left them with a story they couldn't finish, because you didn't play the role they cast you in. You stepped off the stage entirely and rewrote the narrative from a higher place. So now they stare into the silence you left and realize it wasn't a blank space, it was a boundary. And boundaries aren't meant to be broken, they're meant to be respected. If you've ever been told that your calm was weakness, that your silence was cold, that your distance was selfish, remember this. People often confuse peace with punishment because they've never experienced love without chaos. But not you. You are proof that love doesn't have to be loud, that presence doesn't need to perform, that sometimes the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all. And if you're still wondering if it mattered, look at who's reaching out. Your stillness stirred something they didn't know was buried. Your detachment disrupted a dynamic built on their control. Your calm became their storm, and that's why it lingered. So take a deep breath and remind yourself of the power you reclaimed, not by being louder, but by being better, quieter, clearer. Say it with me. My silence speaks. Write it in the comments. Let them see it. Let the world see it. Show them that not all strength screams. Some of it walks away and never has to look back. My silence speaks. Type it, feel it, live it. You don't need to be remembered, because the right ones will never forget the peace you brought with you. Number 2. When their story collapses in the silence you left behind. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. They told themselves a story, a carefully crafted script to shield the ego and soften the sting. They didn't care. I made the right choice. They'll come back eventually. It was soothing, like a blanket pulled over the eyes. Not because it was true, but because it kept the truth at bay. See, when someone walks away, our minds scramble to stay in control, to protect our pride. So we rewrite the ending and place ourselves as the one who chose peace, even if we were the ones who couldn't handle it when we had it. But something happened that wasn't part of their narrative. You didn't return. You didn't send the text they were counting on. You didn't orbit their world with breadcrumbs of hope. You didn't try to rewrite the story. They were too busy scripting alone. And that's when the cracks began to show. Because you weren't supposed to stay gone. You were supposed to flinch. You were supposed to beg or break. You were supposed to react, to say something, anything that would affirm the version of you they created. But you didn't. Your stillness wasn't passive. It was surgical. Your absence wasn't avoidance. It was awakening. And it became a problem for the illusion they lived in. They started checking your page, watching your silence like a hawk, looking for clues in blank spaces. They wanted proof that you were hurting too, that they still mattered, that they could still pull you back with the slightest signal. But none of it came. No collapse, no chaos, no closure. Instead, you vanished, with dignity, not drama, with clarity, not confusion, and your absence forced them to confront the truth they buried under their ego. They didn't walk away from indifference. They walked away from depth, from stability, from peace. And peace, once tasted, becomes harder to live without than any chaos ever was. You weren't playing games. You weren't punishing. You were simply choosing yourself. Quietly, powerfully, completely. That's the kind of energy that doesn't scream for attention. It becomes the attention. Because while others try to be remembered through performance, you became unforgettable through poise. The late-night justifications began to collapse. Maybe they needed space. Maybe they're just waiting for the right time. But as time stretched into stillness and silence turned into certainty, that story broke. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. What if they're really gone? And in that question came the unraveling, because your detachment forced them to confront their own decisions, without distraction, without interference, without you rescuing the narrative. That's the quiet strength of someone who truly lets go. It doesn't come with fanfare. It comes with freedom. As Epictetus once said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life, and it is attained by letting go of what is not in your control." You embodied that. Not resistance, but release. Not silence as a weapon, but as a boundary, a mirror. And when someone stares into that mirror long enough, it begins to show things they tried to avoid: their impulsiveness, their pride, their fear of depth disguised as independence. Why haven't they reached out? Why do they look like they're thriving? Why can't I stop thinking about someone who made no effort to come back? Because your lack of reaction was the reaction. Your peace was the message. Your absence was the contrast to every shallow connection that followed. And eventually, that realization blooms into a message. Not out of clarity, but confusion. Not out of strength, but shame. Not because time healed the wound, but because time exposed it. You didn't explain. You didn't defend. You didn't break your silence to soothe theirs. You walked with wisdom. You stayed still. And it was that stillness that tore the fabric of their story. Now, while they sit in questions they never thought they'd ask, you remain centered, grounded, unshaken. That's what power looks like when it matures. That's what peace feels like when it's no longer tied to validation. So if you've ever been the one whose silence changed the entire narrative, know this: you didn't lose anything by not responding. You protected something sacred, your self-respect. Say it with me: detached, not defeated. Type it in the comments. Let them see it. Let you see it. Because the ones who need to hear your voice the most will hear it in your quiet. And the ones who didn't value your peace will always feel its absence. Detached, not defeated. Write it now. Live it always. Number 3. The weight of what was quietly lost. Sometimes we don't recognize the weight of what we carry until we feel the freedom of its absence, and sometimes we don't recognize the weight of someone's presence until it's gone. You were the quiet center of their storm, the steady rhythm in a world that never stopped spinning. You didn't come in like thunder. You arrived like still water, reflective, calm, dependable. No fireworks, no grand speeches, just presence. And that's exactly why they never thought it would leave. In a world addicted to extremes, drama, chaos, emotional whiplash, your peace didn't ask for attention. It just was. And so, like most truly valuable things, it was taken for granted. They didn't realize that your emotional availability wasn't loud, but it was consistent, that you didn't overwhelm, but you anchored, that you didn't fill every space, but the space you occupied always felt whole. You were the pause between sentences that made the meaning sink in, the quiet, "I'm here," when words weren't needed, the stability that asked for nothing, yet gave everything. And then you left. Not dramatically, not loudly, just left. With dignity, with clarity, with peace. No final plea, no ego-fueled monologue, no guilt trip, just absence. And that absence, it didn't leave a void. It revealed one, because what vanished wasn't just a person. It was the quiet reassurance that someone had their back without conditions. It was the calming presence in the middle of daily storms. It was the feeling of being emotionally safe, even in silence. Suddenly, the comfort they never thanked began to haunt them. Their days became noisier, but emptier. Their nights more crowded, but colder. Conversations started to feel scripted. Compliments felt hollow. Every interaction seemed to skim the surface, but nothing touched the depth you once offered without effort. That's what true emotional grounding does. It's not loud. It doesn't compete. It grounds. And once it's gone, everything else feels like static. They may have filled their time with others, people louder, flashier, maybe even momentarily exciting, but that excitement fades quickly when it isn't built on connection. Because connection isn't about sparks, it's about stillness. You didn't chase attention. You didn't try to prove your worth with noise. You simply showed up with calm, and that calm wasn't flashy, but it was felt. Felt in how you listened. Felt in how you stayed steady during their storms. Felt in the way you made them feel seen, even when they didn't know how to ask for it. That's the part they can't replace. Not with volume, not with charm, not with temporary distractions. And that's what begins to echo months later. It starts quietly, maybe in the silence after a bad date, maybe in the middle of a crowded room that still feels hollow, maybe when a familiar song plays, or when they catch themselves laughing, but it doesn't feel real. That's when the ache arrives, not because of something you did, but because of what you were, and what no one else has been since. And suddenly, that late-night message appears. "Hey, just thinking about you." It sounds casual, but behind it is a question they don't know how to ask. Why did I let go of someone who made me feel more myself than anyone else ever has? Because it wasn't just about your availability. It was about your energy, your peace, your presence. You didn't beg to be chosen. You didn't perform for validation. You lived in such a way that choosing you felt like home. And now they realize what they lost wasn't just a partner. It was their anchor. You didn't break them. You didn't punish them. You just lived with quiet grace and walked away without asking for applause. That's what leaves the deepest imprint. Because while others tried to impress them with noise, you left behind peace. And peace isn't easily forgotten. So if you've ever walked away in quiet strength, if you've ever been the calm in someone else's chaos, and they only realized it when you were gone, remind yourself of this. You didn't need to prove your value. You were the value. Say it with me. I leave peace. Write it in the comments. Let them see it. Let you own it. Because the world doesn't always understand the power of calm until the storm returns. But when you are peace itself, your absence will always be louder than someone else's noise. I leave peace. Type it. Stand in it. Let the silence speak for you. Number 4. When just checking in isn't what it seems. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. You've seen it before. That message wrapped in casual softness. Hey, just thinking about you. Hope you're doing well. How have you been? It arrives like a gentle breeze, but carries the weight of a storm long denied. At first glance it seems harmless, thoughtful even, but beneath its surface lies something much less innocent. Not love, not clarity, curiosity, disguised, dressed up, softened at the edges, but sharp in intention. What they're really asking isn't how you are, it's where you stand. Is the door still cracked? Is the light still on? Is your heart still holding a space they once occupied, but never fully appreciated? They want to know if your silence was stillness or suffering, if your peace was a performance or a real shift in your soul. They're not reaching out for connection, they're reaching out for confirmation, because months have passed and you haven't flinched. You didn't rage. You didn't react. You didn't reach back. That unsettles people who are used to being chased, used to their presence being an anchor in your emotional tides. But when you let go with calm certainty, when your detachment wasn't laced with bitterness but with balance, something shifted in the space they once controlled. Your silence became louder than their attention ever was. And now they're poking at the quiet, wondering if it will still answer to their call. Not all curiosity is rooted in care. Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes it's ego. Sometimes it's just an echo of control slipping through their fingers. They say, just checking in, but what they really mean is, why aren't you orbiting me anymore? Why does your energy feel so far away? Why does your calm feel like closure I didn't approve? That's the thing about emotional detachment rooted in wisdom. It can't be manipulated. It doesn't bend for breadcrumb affection or nostalgic guilt. Because when you've done the inner work, when your peace is no longer negotiable, you see those messages for what they are. A mirror, not a doorway, and most can't handle their own reflection. Because if they had truly moved on, why reach back? If they felt complete, why search for fragments? If your presence meant so little, why does your absence echo so loudly? What they're trying to resolve isn't between the two of you, it's within them. The message isn't an invitation, it's an investigation, a test, a scan, a reach into the past to see if it still has a pulse. But here's what the emotionally grounded soul understands. Curiosity is not commitment. Regret is not readiness. And the soul who has mastered stillness doesn't respond out of habit. They respond, if at all, from alignment. You're not here to soothe someone else's uncertainty. You're not here to validate a chapter they closed carelessly. You're not here to fill the silence they created. You are here for peace, for presence, for growth. So when that vague little message pops up on your screen at 9:43 p.m. and your heart tugs at the memory of what was, pause, breathe. Remember who you've become in the silence. Remember what it took to reclaim your power. Remember how loud your stillness became without ever having to raise your voice. You're not cruel for not replying. You're not cold for protecting your peace. You're just aware enough to know the difference between sincerity and self-soothing. If they truly valued you, they would have shown it before the absence became deafening. Not now, when silence has become proof of your evolution. So if you've ever received that message, casual in tone, but heavy in subtext, remember, it's not always a sign to reopen the door. Sometimes it's a sign to reinforce it. Say it with me. Curiosity isn't clarity. Type it in the comments. Let them see it. Let yourself feel it. You don't need to respond just because they finally did. Because real power isn't in the message you send. It's in the ones you don't. Curiosity isn't clarity, and your peace doesn't answer to mixed signals. Number 5. When you become the standard, they measure everyone against. A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a person perfected without trials. They moved on. At least that's what they told themselves. New faces, new voices, new distractions, fresh notifications lighting up the phone like artificial sparks, meant to replace the steady flame you once were. They called it healing, growth, moving forward. But what they were really doing was burying the silence, not breaking it. They filled their days with noise, thinking motion could replace meaning, that if the calendar stayed full, the heart would eventually feel whole again. But what most people never admit is that time doesn't always dilute feelings. Sometimes it distills them. It sharpens contrast. It removes illusions. It forces us to finally feel the difference between what was real and what merely distracted us from reality. And slowly, quietly, that difference began to show. The new ones talked more, but said less. They were louder, funnier, more eager, but not deeper. Their charm came wrapped in performance, not presence, because anyone can show up when the lights are on. But not everyone brings warmth when the room goes dark. That's when the memory of you started creeping back in, not like a storm, but like still water that hadn't truly settled. You weren't the loudest voice in the room. You were the grounding energy. You didn't chase. You led. Not with pressure, not with noise, but with presence. While others sought to impress, you offered peace. While others clung in fear, you allowed space. While others reacted from emotion, you responded with intention. You weren't just emotionally available. You were emotionally anchored. And that is what doesn't fade. Because when someone experiences a presence that's not performative, it's unforgettable. It doesn't scream to be seen. It's felt, in the body, in the soul, in the quiet moments after all the noise is gone. Your calm wasn't a strategy, it was who you were. And that quiet self-assurance, that stillness wrapped in strength, it made its mark. Now, as the months roll by, the illusion of moving on starts to wear thin. The laughter at dinner feels rehearsed. The late-night texts feel weightless. The compliments fall flat. And somewhere in between the shallow laughs and forgettable dates, the truth begins to echo. This doesn't feel like that. Not because you were perfect, but because you were present. Because you weren't trying to be chosen. You simply lived in a way that made being with you feel like home. And now, every new connection is a comparison. Not intentionally, not out loud, but internally, in the quiet spaces where truth whispers and pride can't interrupt. They may never admit it, but you've become the reference point, the hidden benchmark they now hold others against. And the weight of that comparison is heavier than they expected. Because once someone experiences peace, it becomes hard to settle for performance. And here's what most never realize. You didn't try to be unforgettable. You didn't try to leave a legacy. You didn't try to become the standard. You simply lived by principle. You walked in peace. You let your energy speak louder than your ego ever could. You didn't chase comparison. But now, you are the comparison. Not because you asked to be remembered, but because you made forgetting you feel like losing something rare. That's the power of grounded presence. That's what lingers when the charm fades. That's what returns in the quiet. So when that message finally comes through, maybe a hey, maybe something vague and nostalgic, it's not about rekindling the past. It's about reckoning with the present. It's about realizing that what you gave wasn't just connection. It was calm. It was clarity. It was something they didn't know how to hold until they were handed noise instead. And now they carry the weight of that difference. A weight that doesn't disappear. A weight that whispers your name in every shallow encounter that follows. So if you've ever been the one who didn't shout to be seen, if you walked with peace and let others meet you in truth, or not at all, remind yourself of this. You didn't lose anything. You became something they couldn't replace. Say it with me. I am the standard. Write it in the comments. Let them read it. Let yourself feel it. Not from ego, but from truth. From knowing your worth no longer bends for comparison. It sets it. I am the standard. Own it. Stand in it. And never shrink from the silence that proves it. Number 6. When closure isn't a conversation, it's a choice. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Sometimes they don't reach out because they miss you. They reach out because the story didn't end the way they wanted it to. Not with closure, not with chaos, not with clarity they could control. Just silence, stillness, a goodbye they never got to script. They were expecting a final scene, one where emotions spilled, where words broke open the heart, one last conversation where they held the power, the closure, the emotional upper hand. They were expecting you to show up one more time, just so they could feel like the one who walked away on their terms. But instead, you didn't offer that performance. No late-night monologue, no confession, no final act, just exit. Clean, clear, complete. You didn't chase after validation. You didn't ask for explanations. You simply stopped giving energy to someone who no longer had the capacity to receive it. And that's what shook them. Because when someone is used to emotional chaos, a calm goodbye feels like abandonment. When they're used to being pursued, your stillness feels like rejection. But it's not rejection, it's resolution. Not theirs, yours. See, some people don't want healing, they want control. They want to dictate the timing of closure. They want to be able to say, "We talked, we ended it." But what happens when you don't play along? What happens when you leave with grace instead of groveling? When you don't rehearse your pain, but simply remove your presence? You break their script. And in the silence, the truth shows up without permission. Because closure doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in restraint. Sometimes it walks out the door with its head held high and doesn't look back. You didn't need an apology to heal. You didn't need permission to move on. You didn't need one last emotional round to feel whole again. You chose yourself. Quietly, powerfully, permanently. And now, long after the noise of their distractions fades, long after the crowd, the chaos, and the comfort-seeking ends, they feel it, that unfinished thread, that lack of control, that open loop. Not because they want to return to the connection, but because they never got to finish their story the way they imagined. The message that comes months later, just checking in, been thinking about you, hope you're well. It's not a revival, it's a rewrite, an attempt to soothe the itch of the unknown, to take back some control, to prove to themselves that they could still access you if they wanted to. But what they don't realize is you've already written the final chapter, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with dignity. You don't need to return to an old scene just because someone else didn't finish their lines. You don't owe them your presence just because they suddenly remembered what your absence taught them, because you've done something they never expected. You ended the story without needing an audience. And that kind of closure, the kind no one gives you but you give yourself, it's unshakable, it's clean, it's sacred. They wanted drama. You gave them stillness. They wanted one last emotional exchange. You gave them silence. They wanted to feel powerful. You became free. And now, as the questions echo in their mind, why didn't they fight for it? Why didn't they need a final goodbye? You remain unmoved. Because when your peace becomes more important than your pride, you don't chase endings. You create them. So if someone has ever reached out to you long after things ended, not to reconnect, but just to satisfy their own discomfort, remember this: you don't need to reopen a door just because someone knocks late. You don't need to soothe the very person who once silenced you. You don't need to circle back to pain you already buried. You are allowed to move on without a closing scene. You are allowed to protect your peace without explaining it. You are allowed to say nothing and still mean everything. Say it with me. I choose peace over closure. Type it in the comments. Let it ring louder than any message they didn't send. Let it stand as your declaration, not because you're bitter, but because you're better. I choose peace over closure. Say it, live it, let it echo in every space you never had to revisit. Number 7. When growth becomes the loudest response. First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. They expected you to stay stuck, to linger in the shadow of what was, to wait, to crumble quietly while they moved on loudly. In their mind, you were supposed to stall emotionally, paralyzed by loss, orbiting their absence like a planet without a sun. But you didn't. You didn't pause. You progressed. Not out of spite, not to prove a point, but because you knew healing isn't performance, it's discipline. While they posted, partied, and distracted, you rebuilt. While they sought validation, you found vision. Your silence wasn't emptiness, it was evolution, and that's what unsettles them. They thought they knew you, your limits, your reactions, your need to be seen, but your stillness flipped the script. There was no collapse, no chaos, no closure scene, just calm. Maybe they saw it in a photo. Maybe a friend mentioned the shift. Maybe it was the absence of emotional wreckage that made them curious. That absence became uncomfortable because it wasn't filled with longing. It was filled with peace. Now they wonder, did I misjudge them? Why do they seem untouchable now? Because when someone reclaims their worth without needing to be witnessed, it creates a silence too loud to ignore. You didn't beg, you became. Say it with me. I outgrew the story. Type it in the comments. Let it echo. Let them feel what real growth looks like. Unannounced, undeniable, and completely yours. Number 8. When control fades and power shifts. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. They used to know your rhythm. If they pulled back, you leaned in. If they went quiet, you filled the space. You were the emotional first responder, always ready to repair, reassure, reconnect. That pattern gave them comfort. Not because they valued you deeply, but because they controlled the tempo. They could withhold, withdraw, go cold, and you would chase warmth. But then, something changed. This time, you didn't reach. You didn't send the second message. You didn't rush to fix what they broke with silence. You simply paused, and then stepped back. Not to punish, not to play games, but because you finally understood. Being endlessly available was costing you your peace. You stopped performing love like it was an emergency. You chose stillness over struggle, clarity over craving, dignity over desperation, and that shook the foundation. Because the person they thought they could predict, the one who used to react, plead, or explain, became unreadable. You didn't vanish. You just became untouchable. Now, they're the ones staring into the silence, wondering if they still hold the same pull. They're not reaching out because they love differently. They're reaching because they lost the script. You're not indifferent. You're disciplined. You feel, but you don't fold. You care, but never at the cost of self-respect. Say it with me. I broke the pattern. Type it in the comments. Let the world see what happens when calm becomes your currency. Let them know your silence wasn't surrender, it was self-mastery. I broke the pattern. Own it, live it, move forward in peace. So folks, growth doesn't need a stage. Peace doesn't beg to be understood. And your silence, it was never weakness, it was your power, your protection, your evolution. If this message stirred something in you, let it anchor deeper. Type your affirmation in the comments. Let it be seen. Let it be felt. Let the world know you're not chasing closure. You're choosing clarity. If this spoke to your journey, like the video, share it with someone who needs the reminder. Your value doesn't echo in noise. It lives in stillness. Until next time, stay grounded and never explain your worth to those who overlooked it.